Ezra Sullivan is able to come. Father Ezra is in fact on sabbatical at the moment, but he has agreed to come today for this conference. Father Ezra teaches ethics in the university. He also has established himself now as an expert in canon law, as one of his many different specialisms within this university, and has recently completed a book on approaches to kind of examination of yoga, particularly drawing upon the Thomist tradition. So it's a great delight to have him and to be able to hear a little bit of that project and of his experience of establishing a Thomist approach to the yoga tradition.
Thank you, Father Ganeri, for inviting me and for the organizers of this conference. I'm from California, but that's not where I learned about yoga. I actually started learning about it when I was a novice in Ohio. And it wasn't practiced in our novitiate, but that was done in the 1970s in a different location. It was rather that I was interested in doing, some kind of exercises indoors in the icy winters, and then eventually people started asking me, well, can we do this? Is this something that's appropriate? And as time went on, I didn't find any solid answers. And so this presentation is going to be rather different from the other presentations in that it's a lot more practically minded to come to a number of conclusions. It's the results of over a decade of research. I ended up going to the Himalayas. I sat at the foot of gurus and tried to find out what is this thing called yoga and is it compatible with Christianity. Now, of course, most Westerners in our day have heard of yoga, and many of them, in the United States at least, are familiar with some kind of practice. Nearly every gym offers yoga. Nearly every small town houses some kind of yoga studio, and not a few churches offer it within their own premises. In recent decades in India, the Modi government has created International Yoga Day, and this means that it has by law made yoga a part of compulsory education as included in health and physical education for 10 years for a student going to public school. Going further back, there seems to be evidence that Alexander the Great himself, upon entering the Indus religion, witnessed an early form of yoga. There could be reasonable question as to whether St. Thomas the Apostle, when he arrived on the shores of Kerala, did he encounter yoga? And there's some opinions about that. But there should be no doubt that St. Thomas Aquinas never encountered it. In fact, he encountered nothing like it. The paganism with which he was familiar had very little to do with what I'm exploring today. Nevertheless, I propose that some of Thomas Aquinas' principles are invaluable for understanding and evaluating this complex and rich cultural heritage. What I'm going to do first is sort of breeze through some of the methodological considerations, much of which has been established by previous talks here. And in fact, what I'm going to do is just offer a couple of propositions on how a Thomist might approach not only yoga, but we might say what Aquinas would call pagan thought. And we can say non-Christian thought more generally. These are all defeasible, but I'm not going to offer all of the textual evidence from Thomas's thought because we need to get to the thing at hand. But the first proposition I will say is, first of all, any account of Christian approval of non-Christian thought must be united with frank cautions as well. Some of the church fathers sounded the alarm at any kind of rapprochement with pagan thinkers. We're all familiar with Tertullian's famous trumpeting this dominant note. What does Jerusalem have to do with Athens, the church with the academy, the Christian with the heretic? Tertullian says, I have no use for a Stoic or a Platonic or a dialectic, meaning Aristotelian, Christianity. After Jesus Christ, we have no need of speculation. After the gospel, no need of research. Tertullian, of course, was a lawyer, practically minded. But when it comes to even deeper textual accounts, St. Jerome famously recounted how in a dream God rebuked him for excessive concern in pagan literature that led him away from Christ. And of course, that was Cicero, who among pagan Romans had a lot of wisdom that Thomas Aquinas incorporated into his own thought. Even the church fathers who found value in pagan thought couched their regard with discretion because of what they called the evils of pagan literature. Justin Martyr, for instance, he extolled the wisdom of Socrates, but he spurned the poets who praised the gods, for they, he said, quote, have been told by the power of wicked demons to deceive and lead astray the human race. I think one of the topics that has opened for much more research is not only the question of whether the church fathers had a notion of natural knowledge or supernatural knowledge, but what about preternatural knowledge coming from other spirits? Something worth discussing, but not here. Clement also warned his readers against what he called the siren song of Homer's Odyssey, any teaching, he said, that could endanger the faith by demonic powers. Basil the Great, perhaps, offers the most comprehensive and Irenic patristic treatment of the issue in a treatise called On How to Benefit from Reading Greek Literature. Really, it was a very long lecture that he gave to students upon his own entrance into Christianity to try to help his fellow liberal arts students approach this issue. Even amidst Basil's general openness and quotations positively of poets like Homer and Hesiod and other pagan authors, he warns, "We must watch over our souls with every safeguard, so that we may not unknowingly accept something of the worst kind through the pleasure of the poet's words." He says, like those who ingest poison sweetened with honey. Now, immersed in the fully Catholic medieval culture, Thomas was not faced with paganism as a living reality. And so, therefore, similar to as how the rector pointed out that Kant, didn't encounter any of these world religions that he read about, so likewise, Aquinas, as far as we know, I'd be very surprised if he encountered paganism directly in his life. And so he rarely treats non-Christian religious practices in detail. Indeed, he mostly focuses on what he calls superstition, or idolatry in general, analyzing second-hand textual accounts derived from the Church Fathers and from classic authors such as Cicero. Nevertheless, Aquinas helps to inaugurate, along with the help of his mentor, Albert the Great, a greater openness to pagan thought at the service of Christian thought and life. And what we'll find then is he treats these often as it were, typical ways of thinking, rather than giving a deep textual account aside from the thought of Aristotle, which he comments upon as well known. And so Aquinas will speak about the Platonists, or he'll speak about the pagans, without giving a detailed textual analysis of pagan practice or specific pagan thought. And so this principle then that I'm proposing of having caution while having openness, we see Thomas then both adopting, he cites Virgil's poetry approvingly, and to illustrate things about memory, emotion, and the various modes of knowledge even. It comes from pagan philosophy and poetry within Thomas's own explanation. And yet at the same time, he warns us. He says, when communicating with unbelievers or reading their works, simple people, those who are unused to complex reasoning, he says, simple people or those weak in the faith, they may be subject to subversion. And so they may begin to doubt what is true when faced with alternative perspectives. And so this is just a prudential caution that he offers us. And here I would propose that there's a missiological principle that extended Thomas's both approval and caution in light of the thought of Indian religions. And this is from the Jesuit missionary Roberto de Nobili. De Nobili lived from 1577 to 1656, and he's one of the first to attempt to systematically analyze the laicity of various practices. I thought it was very interesting that the response of Father Galassi pointed out that in order to enter into Eastern thought, he was speaking about Chinese, he says, of course, we know the rights controversy in China, but this is equally the case in India, something often overlooked. But there's a lot of evidence both of textual discussions as well as very practical discussions among bishops and missionaries about what can be done by Christians who are now immersed within Brahmanical priestly culture. So de Nobili was concerned with a lot of things that nowadays are no longer considered as like emblematic of Brahmanic culture. So we won't talk about any of those in detail, but I'll just reaffirm the principle that he, as it were, extends from Aquinas. He says, in furthering the conversion of souls, and in the matter of adopting or allowing the customs of unbelievers, the preacher of Christ must always comport himself in such a manner so as to preclude anything that is in the least sinful, and thereby to secure the conversion of the whole world. So de Nobili draws the line at, if it's sinful, it can't be done. If it's not sinful, then it's at least discussable. What counts as sinful? Anything that is idolatrous, anything that is superstitious, objectively speaking. The Second Vatican Council's document, Ad Gentes number 22, states that any appropriation of non-Christian thought, quote, must avoid every appearance of syncretism and false particularism. John Paul II gives very clear guidance. Similarly, he says, in every case, enculturation must be guided by compatibility with the gospel and communion with the faith of the universal church in full compliance with the church's tradition and with a view to strengthening people's faith. So we might say that the de Nobili principle, avoid what is sinful, discuss what is not sinful, means also the thing on the level of the sinful is denial of the faith, what John Paul II calls syncretism, and the worries of the Second Vatican Council of, as it were, undermining the church's tradition and role. The second principle, I would argue, is non-Christian teachings ought to be seen in light of the truth revealed in Christ. We know that often yoga is characterized as what is called a darshana. It is a Hindu, I would call it a worldview. And this means it's a worldview that's sort of like Pierre Hadot's notion of philosophy as a practice. It's not simply a philosophy as a series of propositions that more or less cohere together that are proposed by a chief thinker. It's rather a way of life that includes a way of looking upon the world, and that way of looking upon the world may be more or less thematized depending on how that practice is incorporated within a community. Now, for Aquinas, as for the rest of the church, Christ is the chief, the full, the definitive revelation of God. He says, our faith rests upon the revelation made to the apostles and the prophets who wrote the canonical works. Jesus Christ is the Word of God who took flesh and revealed the Trinity to us. And so when yoga speaks about either the acceptance of the Vedas, if it's considered a darshana, then it's incorporated within these schools which see the Vedas as revelatory and divine, and therefore as somewhat salvific in effect. And then yoga within its particularities, there's often specific revelations, which might be, as it were, analogous to what we would call within the Catholic Church particular revelation. So in the way that we have the fullness of public revelation now incorporated in Holy Scripture, then we have private revelations, say, to St. Faustina. So likewise within yoga, they have the Vedas, and then they have particular revelations by yogis, or sometimes the writers of yoga classical texts, such as the Shiva Samhita. They will refer to Shiva himself revealing the way of yoga. And so the premise is that this is more than man's thought. It goes beyond nature. And it challenges us with this dichotomy between natural and supernatural, and it proposes the preternatural. And so, if we're going to then consider these preternatural teachings, we have to consider them in light of Christ and his revelation. The third principle is that when learning from non-Christian insights, that do not contradict the Christian faith. We have to respect the historical unfolding of divine revelation as it transforms the world around it. Christ is a man of history. The church does not exist simply as an ideal to be realized in the future. The church is the body of Christ that extends itself through time from his own incarnation. And therefore, St. Paul insists that the Christian faith, he says, does not rest on the wisdom of men, but on the power of God. Ratzinger, in discussing the development of the faith, points out that the transmission of divine revelation to the Hebrews, which is contained in the Old Testament, that is a definitive part of Christian belief. And so Marcionism, as a heresy, would try to, as it were, bracket the whole problem of Hebrew Scripture and bracket the problem of Jewish thought and belief now, and would simply try to propose a sort of simplified gospel. Christ is love, Christ comes to save us, Christ gives us happiness, and the historical development of that is, as it were, ignored in those conversations. Ratzinger points out that this leads to the other problem on the other side of history, namely that Christ's church through time, confronting Roman law, confronting Greek thought, absorbing them within itself and expressing her own beliefs within these modules, this now becomes a part of the very tradition by which we understand divine revelation. And so any encounter now with non-Christian thought has to include both the Old Testament and its contributions, as well as Greek and Roman thought, as part of the ineradicable element of Christian tradition. With all that said then, how do we approach yoga? Well, St. Thomas Aquinas offers a methodological consideration based on Aristotle. And Aristotle points out in his commentary in the Posterior Analytics, he says there are, of course, 4 questions that we want to ask if we are going to know a thing thoroughly, that is, scientifically. He says, quid sit, what is it? On sit, does it exist? Quia, how does it exist or in what way? And finally, propter quid, why or for what reason? And all of these, as it were, if we can draw them together, provide us with a causal structure of the thing we are trying to understand. And so we can reduce them to the 4 causes: the formal, the material, the final, and the efficient. And so I'll ask then, what is yoga in light of trying to expose the causes, insofar as they can be known, in this very complex textual and cultural historical reality? Now, before a person squeezes into yoga pants for the first time, I've never done so, and prior to her first tentative steps in a new studio, the yoga initiate typically has a working definition of yoga, and often it's reduced to what we would call the material cause. In the West, often the way of looking upon yoga is as a series of exercises or stretches. Now, of course, we know that this bewildering variety of practices are somehow all connected to this thing called yoga that has deeper roots. Now, of course, Nietzsche would criticize me for talking about the etymology of a word, but he's not here with his mustache, and so I'll just point out that the word yoga is etymologically derived from Sanskrit origins. The verbal root yuj is incorporated into English as yoke. Yoga, yoke, to join or to fasten, as in a harness. And this can have all sorts of other kinds of deeper meanings, just as heaven, Tian, can mean the physical heaven, or it can mean like the spiritual abode of the gods or the spirits. So likewise, yoga has a material meaning, and it can have a formal meaning. The material meaning of yoga doesn't just mean the material thing, the physical thing, but it's, as it were, the grasp of something. So for instance, I could talk about the yoga of penmanship. And what I would mean is, I have mastered the art of writing beautifully. So I have the yoga of this thing. Now, the yoga of the human being means in some way within the yoga mindset is the mastery of the human being, and then the union of the human being with some higher principle. Perhaps this constellation of meanings, this idea sometimes even means magic, yoga as the power by which I can perform some action beyond myself, the union of me with the elemental forces of the world. All of this comes together as a putting together of two things. Now, sometimes it's thought of as the two things that are put together are my body and soul. Sometimes it's Shiva's power and myself. Or perhaps it's my individual self and the supreme self. However we look at it, this notion of yoga means that there's some kind of material principle and a formal principle that through this practice unite them and give the individual some sort of self-improvement. Whether this is for the final cause, such as healing or emotional stability, some kind of peace or self-integration, or whether on a lower level a person is going to try to come to be united with the principles of existence itself. The physical postures of yoga then can be seen as the external material elements that draw together the formal meaning that the teacher of yoga, the gurus, are trying to inculcate. Amid a superficial tolerance for diversity of traditions and practices, Susan Newcomb says, she's an expert on yoga scholarship, she points out that often there's a tendency with people to say, oh, it's all true, it's all yoga, until they find something, she says, quote, that they disagree with. Then they categorize it as not true yoga. Now, Newcomb, she argues that this is due to what she calls essentialist definitions. Contrary definitions that try to hit at some essence that is unseeable and unfindable. She seems to be some sort of nominalist. But I believe that underneath this, if there can be a true or authentic yoga and a false or a superficial yoga, that means that there must be an essential yoga that underlies them by which we measure them. This is a basic Aristotelian logical principle. So my proposal for the definition would be the following. Material cause. Yoga is a holistic but flexible and adaptive way of life. Efficient cause, originating in India, manifesting itself in Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and the secular West. Formal cause. Its worldview is rooted in ancient teachings, especially the Vedas. Its different versions entail practices that include postures, breathing, and meditation, the methodical practice of which conduces to bodily and mental regulation. And then finally, it aims proximately for physical and mental well-being, but ultimately the union of the personal self with a greater divinity found within. And this union is thought to result in extraordinary perceptions and power. For the sake of time, I'm going to have to skip over the question quia, how does yoga exist in the modern world? Because it exists in a huge variety of ways. And we'll start to note that yoga practitioners themselves, a number of studies show that although people initially adopt yoga for stress and for exercise, over 62% of students and 85% of teachers change their primary reason for practicing, and they maintain it for spiritual reasons. Research in Australia shows that after 7 years of yoga practice, it was correlated with a reduction in Christian orientation and a corresponding potential increase in non-religious spirituality such as Buddhism over the same period. Again, one more statistic. Among regular yoga practitioners averaging 13 years of practice, 78 called it a spiritual path. What we find then is that yoga is more than just a body in a position. Remember Aristotle's categories, posture is one of the categories. And he says it's the arrangement of the body in a particular way. And so you can be sitting or standing or lying down and so on. This is only the material element. The formal element is the meaning of what you're doing. And that includes in some way its finality, namely, why are you doing it? Blessed Humbert of Romans, in discussing the Dominican tradition of bodily movement in prayer, and specifically our practices within the divine office, whereby we bow at the Gloria Patri et Filio, he says that many bodily movements can take on several meanings. And he points out that within sacred scripture, bowing may be to bow to a king, or it may be to receive a blessing. Bowing may be an act of penitence or an act of adoration. So what this means then is that the polyvalent nature of physical action applies to many, if not most, yoga postures. Bowing to the ground. Supposing that the physical movement is exactly the same, this bowing movement could be paying homage to the guru's lotus feet, insofar as he's thought to be divine, which definitely happens. It could be bowing down, Christ washing the feet of his disciples on Holy Thursday. Or it could be a podiatrist leaning forward to examine a patient's long toenails. Or it could be a Christian's worshipful act before an icon of Christ. The result then is that in order to evaluate the action, we have to evaluate not just the physical act, but its deeper meaning as embedded within a community. Just as language, as words, exist only within a community because they are man-made things, so likewise bodily language and bodily movement exist within a community who has adopted them as their own and imbues these formal elements now in a physical expression. And therefore, to assess yoga, then one would have to assess its objective form as it exists within that tradition. Just as we would never say that simply bowing down within a church is an act of adoration, because it may be that someone went there to tie his shoes and they didn't know it. So likewise, to evaluate yoga, we have to look at its contextual clues. And therefore, I would suggest that the physical movements themselves are an insufficient marker of what yoga is. Rather, what we have to look at is what de Nobili calls the form of the practice, namely the formal cause. And so an indication of whether a thing is yogic or not includes following elements. For example, combining postural practice, preceding or accompanying it with chants or meditations, invocations to Hindu divinities or gurus, having intentions that the posture itself will awaken certain powers that come from beyond the individual, such as opening the third eye, awakening the spirit of Kundalini that supposedly exists at the bottom of the spine. Speaking in yogic language to describe what one does, for example, describing the postures as named in virtue of Hindu gods or gurus, divinities, or heroes. This happens too. Accompanying a yoga practice with specifically yogic or Hindu symbols, such as the Om symbol, Sanskrit chants, a statue or picture of divinity. Practicing postures within a yogic location, such as an ashram, a guru's home, or place considered sacred by yogis. All of these are contextual clues that show us the meaning of the postural language, just as the meaning of a word is going to have a specific context if it's English within America versus English in England, or if we're speaking a dialect that exists in a different place. So what I would say then in conclusion is that the formal elements within yoga, if there's any element of the meaning that's incompatible with Christian faith or practice, that it either has to be abandoned or transformed. Whatever is incompatible with Christian faith and morals needs to be substituted with something that is compatible. And so one perhaps could rename the postures, or one could go about engaging in them in a way that abandons all the contextual elements that I said that are tied to philosophies incompatible with Christian belief. And so what this means then is that the practice of trying to understand what yoga is bound up with our understanding of its own history. And so this becomes then a challenge for all of us to evaluate practices both in light of Christian physical practice, Christian belief, but also within the embedded meaning found within the traditions and practices of yogis themselves. Thank you.
So we'll just have a couple of minutes now if there's any observations or questions for Father Ezra before we move on to the next talk.
Hi, Father. Pastoral question.
Yeah.
With the care of souls,
Yeah.
when you meet Catholics who are practicing yoga, do we need to give them specific guidance for things to be aware of, to avoid, or do we need to dissuade them altogether?
Yeah, so I would say that as a whole, yoga is incompatible with Christianity because it's all of those things put together. It's the formal element, the meaning, along with the practices. And of course, Christians should be encouraged to do exercise as appropriate, but the reason why people start to adopt spiritual practices is because as a whole, it tends to bring the bodily meaning into the spiritual meaning. And so, so practicing yoga in a parish or something like that implicitly adopts all of those formal meanings and intentions within the practice, and that's going to be a problem.
If someone's very attached to it, how important is it to bring them away from it?
I would say, well, I'll put it this way. I mean, this is going to be very controversial, but I've talked with exorcists in the United States, here in Italy, one of the chief exorcists for the Vatican, as well as in Manila. And all of them affirm that if you call upon the gods to inhabit your body, they will. Yeah.
What have you offered to practice to Christ?
I don't understand the question.
Okay, so what if you are doing a physical routine and instead of inviting the spirit of Shiva or Vishnu, what if you pray to the Holy Spirit, does that change the form and nature of the practice?
I would say this is a very interesting question because rarely do people say, can I offer up my running on the streets of Rome to God? Of course you can, but people rarely do. Or can I offer up lifting weights to Jesus? Sure you can, why not? But people rarely do. Because people have a pretty clear idea of the difference between a physical activity and a spiritual activity that I'm offering to God. The subtlety of the yoga universe blurs the lines and proposes that my physical practice becomes a spiritual practice. And it's very interesting to ask yourself, why would we want to do that for these kinds of stretches, and yet I don't offer up to God many of these other physical activities? Sure, if I'm hiking up, in Abruzzo, sure, I can offer that up to God. There's some beautiful views there. But often people have a clear understanding that I'm hiking right now, and I thank God for it, but this isn't itself a spiritual practice. So in theory, one could do so, but often that includes adopting a yogic perspective, which blurs this material and formal boundary. So, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So we move on to our final talk today. Professor Thomas Cottoy teaches here in the Angelicum. He teaches many things, but it would be fair to say his specialization is both in patristics and Eastern Christianity and Buddhism. So we're delighted for him to come in here today and take part in this day's conference and to talk to us about a Thomist encounter with Buddhism.
I'll move here. Thank you. So I call these people Thomism in Lhasa, Ippolito Desideri's engagement of Tibetan Buddhism as a model for a new apologetics. I wrote an article some time ago and I called it, What Does Lhasa Have to Do with Jerusalem? And I like the title, but I can't use it each time. But I thought it would have been fitting here too. And another qualifier is that perhaps I am more skeptical than some of the other presenters today, somewhat. So I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit towards the end. And maybe we should also put a question mark at the end of this title and wonder whether, is this really what we should be doing, or perhaps we should be doing something slightly different? So today we looked at a lot of text, so maybe you can look at a map for the change. So on March 18th, 1716, after a long journey across the Tibetan plateau, the Italian Jesuit missionary Ippolito Desideri, who lived between 1684 and 1733, reached Lhasa. Born in the city of Pistoia, in the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, Desideri had gone through the customary Jesuit education at the Collegio Romano. Before Michelangelo Tamburini, who at the time was the general of the Society of Jesus, assigned him to the Indian missions. Desideri left Rome in September 1712 and reached the Jesuit mission in Goa 1 year later, eventually reaching Agra in northern India in the fall of 1714. The Italian Jesuit and his Portuguese companion Manuel Freire would then undertake a long and difficult journey to Tibet, stopping for a while at the court of the king of Ladakh, which is now in India, before joining an armed caravan for the 7 months long trek across the Tibetan plateau. Left alone by his companion, Desideri remained in Tibet until January 1721, so somewhat less than 5 years. Eventually, as a consequence of a protracted controversy with the Capuchins, who claimed sole jurisdiction over the Tibetan mission, the Jesuit received an order from his superior to leave Tibet and return to Agra. In fact, there is really no record of Desideri ever interacting with any Dominicans, because there were no Dominicans in Tibet at all. There were some Jesuits and some Franciscans, but really no Dominicans. And the only other Christians were Armenians. So, in 1727, Desideri left to return to Europe, hoping to argue in favor of the Jesuits' Tibetan mission. But in 1732, the Vatican authorities gave the Capuchins the exclusive rights to evangelize in the region. Deeply disappointed, Desideri was never able to return to Lhasa and died in Rome in 1733. So we actually have some portraits of him here, made when he was still alive. Desideri's memoirs of his journey to Asia carry the title Notizie storiche del Tibet e memorie dei viaggi e missione ivi fatta, known as the Relazione, a work that contains the earliest and most comprehensive account in the European language of the Tibetan culture and religion. In fact, it's interesting, the Capuchins, who were in Lhasa for far longer than Desideri, never actually learned Tibetan and only worked through translators and interpreters. So he was the first one who actually engaged in sort of a sustained study of the local culture. His theological legacy, however, is not to be found in the Relazione, which is the text that everybody reads, and now there is an English translation that came out in 2010. Because his mastery of the Tibetan language allowed him to author a number of treatises in classical Tibetan that dealt with questions such as the existence of a first cause or the belief in reincarnation. So it's very interesting because all his theological writings are actually in classical Tibetan. His memoirs are in Italian. He didn't actually choose to write any theology in Italian or Latin at the time. These Tibetan works that you see listed here were made possible by his stay at the great monastic academies of Sera, where he familiarized himself with different Tibetan philosophical systems and the monastic tradition of debate. I have myself stayed there. Later on, Desideri would engage in further debates with monks from the monasteries of Drepung and Ganden, which is, even now one of the largest monastic academies of Tibet at an altitude of 4,300 meters. Desideri would soon realize, however, that his interlocutors were willing to listen to his arguments with kindness and politeness, but they were also firmly convinced of the correctness of their views. And also, they were more than willing to discuss even the most abstruse philosophical claims in great detail under clear logical reasoning. So clearly, as Desideri notes in his Relazione, the Tibetans would not just allow anyone to merely instruct them into a different worldview. So he wrote his, 4 treatises. You see, the Dawn, the essence of the Christian religion, the origin of all sentient beings, and the highest and ultimate good, and the far, far longer treatise known as the Inquiry. You can see the Tibetan title is quite impressive. It's just recently been partially translated into English by Harvard University Press. Now, what is Desideri actually doing here? Many of you will be familiar with this text by another Jesuit, Francis Clooney. Hindu God, Christian God. And look at the subtitle, how reason helps break down the boundaries between religions. Reason. Now, Clooney says, and many of you who have worked in comparative theology will be familiar with these 4 sort of points that he makes, that Christian theology in the future should have a number of specific characteristics. And he wrote these more than 20 years ago. First of all, Christian theology must remain confessional, or must be rooted in a specific Christian ecclesial tradition. Number 2, it must continue to be systematic, seeking to offer a comprehensive speculative account of the Christian faith. Number 3, it has to be dialogical, going out into the world and engaging members of different religious traditions in a dialogue. And finally, it must also be comparative. Now, admittedly, Clooney seems to think that all theology ought to be comparative. I don't think I really agree with that, because certainly there is legitimate room for non-comparative theology, but I mean, this is what he says here. However, what is really very important is what Clooney is saying there in the subtitle, because he thinks that what ultimately can solve interreligious conflict and really help us engage the religious other is reason. But let us just ask ourselves, what does this actually even mean? Which kind of reason? Which reason? You know, and the matter is not even really addressed, because surely rational argumentation can take all sorts of shapes and forms. And if we look at Karl Rahner, you know, chapter 6 of Foundations of Christian Faith, when discussing his understanding of the hypostatic union, Karl Rahner also seems to imply that the deployment of our rational faculties is going to help us discern which aspects of these writings are inspired and which other passages of the same sacred writings are perhaps flawed or, you know, characterized by a partial or incomplete inspiration. So even there, we're not really told how we can discern between inspired and non-inspired texts. How are we supposed to use reason? Is reason going to tell us that Book 11 of the Bhagavad Gita, with its descriptions of Krishna's transfiguration, can be regarded as inspired, whereas other discussions of caste in the same text fall outside the reach of the Holy Spirit? It's not actually very clear. However, if we turn to Desideri, we actually find that the modality of rational argument embraced by the Tuscan Jesuit is something far more rigorous than both the vague invocation of anonymous Christianity that you find in Rahner, but also something which is far removed from Enlightenment rationality. And really what we find is the kind of rationality or reason that sustained the medieval scholastic tradition of vision, something taken from Aristotle, later systematized by Thomas in defense of the Christian dogma. So Desideri views very clearly all kinds of speculative reasoning, all the kind of speculative reasoning that he found in the Tibetan tradition, as a mode of preparatio Christi. Non-Christian philosophical systems were, of course, flawed, but contain elements of truth that would blossom once exposed to the sun of Christian revelations. So essentially what we have here is a Jesuit who is really a scholastic. It's actually very interesting. You know, and I want to talk today really about the Byung Kun, you know, which is translated sometimes as the dawn, but it's really the origin, the source of all living beings and all things, where he discusses the notion of pratitya samutpada, or codependent origination, which, well, in Tibetan is actually known as tendrel, but often, you know, Desideri also uses the Sanskrit terms, you know, and there's this one passage towards the end of part 1 of the Byung Kun that I have here, where Desideri states in a matter-of-fact way, if one acknowledges and accepts that there is a self-existent being, the doctrine of codependent origination makes total sense. But if one does not, such doctrine cannot be explained, because it is only by accepting the existence of such a being, meaning a self-existent being, that we can explain how effects are produced by causes. Conversely, by denying that such a being exists, we can no longer justify that effects are produced by their causes, for this can only be accounted for by positing an uncaused cause at the beginning of it all. From this paragraph, we can evince Desideri's theological methodology. What we have here is an engagement of a pivotal doctrine from the belief system of his interlocutors. This engagement acknowledges the speculative import of the system in offering an adequate description of reality. At the same time, Desideri does not shy away from offering a critique of its purported flaws, and he turns to traditional metaphysics to supplement the original doctrine and bring out its full metaphysical potential. So readers who perhaps might expect Desideri to dismiss codependent origination, which is customarily used to justify teachings such as reincarnation, for instance, you know, people expecting him to dismiss this altogether as against reason and against scripture, as intrinsically flawed, will be disappointed, because Desideri views pratitya samutpada as a springboard that can introduce Tibetans to the Aristotelian scholastic teaching of the first cause. The paradoxical implication of this paragraph is that Tibetans who use reason correctly should conclude that their own teaching about causation requires a first cause. So it's their own teaching that necessitates this kind of supplementation from the outside. In other words, it's their own teaching of codependent origination that inevitably demonstrates the logical necessity of theism. In this perspective, Desideri's task is, what he's actually setting out to do, is to disentangle the intricate web of implications that accompany Pratitya Samutpada and that the Tibetans themselves are reluctant to consider. It's almost like he's trying to force them to reflect on implications of the teaching that they themselves don't want to look at. As a result, Madhyamaka, which is the philosophical system underpinning the discussion of Pratitya Samutpada in Tibet, Madhyamaka is seen as a philosophy, a first philosophy, in need of Aristotelian correctives, which, when adequately corrected or integrated with further elements, necessarily debunks what Tibetans viewed as its original conclusions. Now, the first part of the Byung Kun, this text, explores the nature of the first cause and includes actually three arguments. Number one, the existence of a first cause, who is the origin of all things. Number two, the eternity of the first cause. And finally, number three, the independence of the first cause from all contingent realities. Desideri notes at the very outset that every aspect of the natural order must have a principle or an origin. In fact, he points out, and of course this is a kind of captatio benevolentia for his audience, even the remarkable happiness that one can see in all of Tibet must have its origin in the rule of the king of Tibet. King of Tibet not being the Dalai Lama, but the civil ruler at the time. Desideri's understanding of causality also stresses that every cause contains in acto within itself what will be manifest in potentia in the effect. Whatever is being moved, for instance, has received the action of a cause moving it. In living beings, the movement is of course imparted by the vital principle, which in the case of inanimate beings, while in the case of inanimate beings, the movement is imparted by some other agent. And then Desideri mentioned something else that the Tibetans used to sort of mention a lot in their myths, which is their belief in a sky which has many levels. And in that system, the highest sky imparts movement on the lowest sky. But the highest sky does not actually require any power to move. Think of that. If this is the case, Desideri argues, it is then possible to think of a cause that does not depend on any other cause, but causes all movements because of its intrinsic power, because this highest sky does not require the movement of any other sky to be moved. So essentially, as you can see, what Desideri is doing is to rephrase Thomas's appropriation of the Aristotelian taxonomy of causality, relying on an example that is familiar to his Tibetan audience. So as to show that even they already have the notion of a prime mover, you see. So it's almost like he's claiming that the Tibetans have an unacknowledged yearning or desire for a first cause that would provide metaphysical support for their own teaching of Pratitya Samutpada. And then he says, well, could the Buddha be such a cause? And then, Desideri concludes that clearly the Buddha himself, the historical Buddha, who actually plays a surprisingly small part in Tibetan thought in general, the Buddha could not be such a cause because the Buddha might have had extraordinary attributes, but could not really possess the infinite power to rule over the whole universe without limits. I can already think of what some Tibetans might have said, because many Tibetans of course believe in the universality of the Buddha nature and could have countered this argument saying that actually the Buddha nature is what sustains the universe as a whole. But Desideri is not really thinking about that. What he's trying to say is that the Tibetans' own philosophical traditions, once its implications have been brought into the open, proves the superior rationality of Christian metaphysics. Now, another similar strategy is then deployed to rehearse the classical Thomist claim that there cannot possibly be an infinite chain of causes, but there must be a cause that is not moved by others, but moves all of them. Clearly aware of the importance of lineage, Desideri points out that all the wisdom shared by the lamas and the gurus of Tibet must necessarily come from one original lama or guru who came to Tibet and was the source of all wisdom who is now in the country. Given Desideri's familiarity with the story of Padmasambhava, whom some of you might know as the second Buddha, the one who brought Buddha to Tibet. Some say he's like the Saint Paul of Buddhism because he becomes almost like more important in the shaping of doctrine than the Buddha himself. It is not impossible that Desideri might have had that in mind. However, he then deploys this argument also to challenge the belief that karma can explain the emergence of samsara. If the karma that comes from meritorious work depends on the practice of the virtues, and he says, with an interesting twist, with the accumulation of happiness, and if it is also true that the karma of demerit comes from indulging to vice, and thus the accumulation of unhappiness, all births must be the consequence of the previous life. This approach, however, does not answer the question of how this cycle of lives might have come into being. If the effects, merely the rebirths, have existed without a beginning, it is not possible to say that the cause has not existed without a beginning, since something must have caused the initial birth of every sentient being, either in a happy or in an unhappy realm. Now, as you can see, in a way, the argument that he's actually developing is more or less, the strategy that he's actually using is very much the same throughout the entire text. What he is trying to accomplish is a sort of qualified retrieval of certain elements of the other philosophical tradition, while critiquing some of its components and supplementing it from elements from his own tradition. In the second book of the same Byung-Kun, Desideri will discuss, for instance, another theme, the theme of emptiness, which essentially affirms the non-existence of substance. And Desideri even there says, well, all the arguments that the Tibetans deploy to prove the transitory quality of all substances in this world actually contain a kernel of truth, because of course reality is dynamic and forever changing. However, even in this case, according to Desideri, the Tibetans' arguments are vitiated by their failure to believe in a final primary ontological basis. First of all, things cannot exist without substance because they must depend on a cause. Desideri quotes Nagarjuna's claim in a treatise known as Mula Majjhimaka Karika that all things have to be understood through action and agent, which means that all things exist only insofar as they are interdependent. A second claim is that the substance is always a concept of the mind and is not derived from a real object and its condition. All aggregates arise from interdependence. Whatever arises in interdependence can never become an independent substance. And there are a number of other very similar claims. Now, Desideri then offers some counter-arguments. He acknowledges that all things are interdependent, but observes that interdependence makes no sense if there is no supreme and independent being, on which the flux of codependent origination actually depends. So, if you see, what he is essentially trying to do is to show that the Tibetans are relying on a flawed or incomplete logic that prevents them from apprehending the reality of the ground of being, since the latter cannot be apprehended through the senses alone. So finally, in Byung-Kun, he concludes saying that the Majjhimaka philosophy is like a horse that alone will run off its track. Tibetans are like passengers boarding a coach that has only one wheel. What they need is a new coachman, and this coachman is essentially scholastic or Aristotelian logic. You see, so in a way, he is always going to acknowledge that there are metaphysical claims made by his interlocutors that are correct, but if left to their own devices, they are going to sort of lead to intellectual and actually practical catastrophe. Now, we should be remiss if we did not consider how some Buddhist authors would actually respond to this kind of argument. And there is a very interesting work by a contemporary Buddhist scholar, J. Garfield, who in his Empty Words, Buddhist Philosophy and Cross-Cultural Interpretation, does not address Desideri directly, but reflects on the way Western scholarship and even sort of classical scholasticism would tend to interpret Majjhimaka categories. Because Garfield references Nagarjuna, whom you see quoted here sitting on a lotus, who is the founder of Majjhimaka. And Garfield says, well, what is emptiness really? Maybe Desideri didn't really understand what emptiness really was, because emptiness transcends the taxonomy of causality altogether. It rests on the self-explanatory and exhaustive presence of a web of conditions engendering phenomenal regularities, even in the absence of inherent substance, is invested with causal powers. If that's the case, the rejection of the first cause would not lead to nihilism, but would merely be part and parcel of an acceptance of an explanatory strategy that would affirm the normativity and indeed the sufficiency of social and linguistic conventions. So, Garfield distinguishes between skeptical solutions, nihilistic solutions, and substantialist solutions, and he says that Buddhism is not nihilistic, it's merely skeptic. It is not denying the existence of reality, it's simply reflecting on the notion of material substance by way of a linguistic strategy that deny that ordinary discourse about reality or subjectivity implicates the concept of a substance. So the conclusion then would be, according to this perspective, that Desideri would have mistaken the Tibetan for nihilists when in fact they are actually merely skeptics, because Shunyata is actually self-explanatory altogether. Now, as you can see, that was kind of like the part of, like the devil's advocate, why is it that the Buddhists would not actually be convinced by this really sophisticated argument? Essentially, what is happening here is that Desideri clearly believed that Madhyamaka philosophy could actually play the role, let's say, of that Aristotelian thought could have played in medieval scholasticism. Madhyamaka philosophy can be the basis for a new approach to Christian theology, for a reformulation or reconfiguration of Christian thought, as long as it is actually corrected. So in the same way as Aquinas would not accept certain ideas like the eternity of the world or the plural, other elements in Aristotelianism per se, in the same way Desideri would say that we can accept Madhyamaka broadly, but certain elements actually have to be rejected. In the same way as, let's say Athanasius of Alexandria, the Cappadocians, took over numerous insights from Hellenist thought. So certainly, Desideri's example is very valuable, but what I'm trying to say is that we should not perhaps conclude too hastily that our interlocutors will immediately necessarily agree with our own conclusions, because, to echo the question raised early, even if we believe that reason will help us in our speculative encounter with the religious author, perhaps many of our interlocutors will actually operate with a different kind of reason, or a different notion of reasons. And I was just thinking of what Father White actually said at the very beginning this morning, saying that perhaps what we need is to be not less ambitious, but actually even more ambitious than we have been until now, because perhaps what we need before we engage in interreligious dialogue, what we need is actually to engage in a kind of philosophical conversations as to what the philosophical parameters of our conversations are actually going to be. Because if we don't have a sort of shared set of philosophical categories or parameters, our conversations will actually perhaps not go all that far. So I'm kind of going to end here, maybe on a less optimistic note perhaps than some others, but thank you. I thought I would do 20 minutes because I thought we would have time for questions. Yes, of course. I'll just switch this off. Okay. If anybody has a question, I don't know.
Thank you very much for that very stimulating talk. We have a few minutes for some questions, observations before we conclude.
Thank you for your presentation and the way you characterize the end of your talk. Makes me wonder, the philosophers among us would say the most important conversations we could be having is philosophy. That in fact, because philosophy is the proto-evangelium, if you don't understand being, then you won't understand God, and therefore you can't even accept Christ. I would agree with that in the order of the things as they are understood within philosophy. But again, one of the things I wonder is, even if Desideri, let's suppose that he has now access to some of these objections to his thoughts, or you want to extend it. You like Desideri, and so now you're going to use Thomistic principles to explain, difficulties with having this as the foundation for Buddhism or Christianity. How effective is that? I mean, it seems to me like you're only appealing to maybe small number of people who are interested in extremely specific philosophical questions. And maybe you'd say it's still valuable. We need to have a philosophical discussion, and at least we can clear away the theoretical problems. And then in terms of preaching the gospel, though, that's for somebody else to have the philosophy book at hand to answer these questions. So I guess I would say most Buddhists probably wouldn't have these questions. I mean, if you have a philosophical discussion, would that really convince them? I'm not sure.
I mean, first of all, we have to remember that when Desideri was there, he's really engaged in a conversation with the sort of monastic academic elites. Not necessarily with the majority of Tibetan population. I mean, until 1950 in Tibet, 90% of the people were illiterate, and they would never have had any understanding of any of this material. So this was in a way a very elite conversation. But what startles Desideri when he gets there, and I mean, I could give you a lot of other examples, for instance, is the fact that, the way, debate is being used. I mean, that what startled him was that they used debate in a way that was very familiar to him because he had been trained in this tradition here where you do a lot of debates, but to reach completely different conclusions. So he goes to Sera and he finds that what do the novices do in Sera? They spend 2 years studying philosophy before studying the sacred Tibetan texts, because you have to study philosophy first before you actually read the texts. And you have these debates, and one of the debates you have to have is to prove the non-existence of a creator God. Because if you use reason correctly, you have to come to the conclusion that the creator God does not exist. So he writes that. And he, of course, had studied here at the Collegio Romano, where people did the exact opposite. So then he realizes, oh my goodness, these people are using reason in a completely different way. And he starts writing his texts, trying to sort of show that their reason, in the way they're using reason is actually in sort of, it actually has to be supplemented or corrected. But the problem is that this becomes almost like a dialogue between two ships that sort of cross each other in the night, because the others are actually going to say that Desideri's way of using reason is actually incorrect. So you have a kind of meta debate on reason that even precedes the theological debate, and you cannot even really have the theological debate because you just cannot really come to any agreement on what reason really is. You see? So that's what I'm saying, is that in a way he has this very interesting method, but I mean, I feel like we need to kind of almost have a meta discussion before the discussion even takes place, because otherwise the discussion is just not going to come to any conclusion. You just go back and forth all the time. Or maybe you need a theology of mission that you also mentioned earlier today, that what we need is a theology of mission. How does, if in order to have a theology of mission, you need to have a set of philosophical parameters that everybody can agree on, otherwise you just can't progress. Sorry. You had a question there.
I think maybe developing from Father Ezra's question, I'm not entirely clear whether you are arguing that the notion of reason in itself is a problem, or that reason operates within different paradigms and therefore does...
No, I'm not saying that the notion of reason itself is a problem, not at all. I am saying that what could be a problem is appealing to a notion of reason in the abstract. When you say, oh, we should just use reason and then we are going to solve all our problems. I think if you just do that, that's going to be a problem, if you don't define what your reason is going to be. Because then you are going to sort of presume that everybody agrees with you on what rationality means and reason means, and that's not going to be the case. And you cannot just proceed. But no, I actually think that reason is extremely important. It's just that you have to come to an agreement on what the parameters of reasons actually are. No, I'm not saying, no, because if you don't have reason, you cannot do anything. So in a sense, I mean, Clooney is right when he says that, but he's kind of not really saying enough, because he's not really explaining what he means by reason. That's all.
So would you, in effect, locate your project in terms of what MacIntyre is doing in philosophy? So he's arguing that, you can actually have rational dialectics, but you can't have it if you assume reason is free-floating because that belongs to one
Yes, I'm not someone who has spent a lot of time studying MacIntyre, but yes, I think I would agree with these sentiments, because I think, yes, reason is not something which just exists like in the abstract, because you have to figure out what you really mean by that, you see. And I mean, Majamaka reason is so completely different from, the way scholastic reasoning functions. And unless you actually sort of really understand that, and you just talk to people who follow Majamaka reasoning, assuming that they share your presumption of what rationality is, you're not going to go anywhere. So then you kind of really have to sort of lay down some parameters first, And even Desideri, perhaps, maybe he was only there for 4 years. If he had been able to stay there longer, he might have actually continued, but he was not able to do that. So in a way, his work was kind of interrupted. Okay. Oh.
Some people say that the Eastern religions, they don't have the principle of non-contradiction. Do you think that's another way of determining the problem that you're talking about?
That's something that people say. It is somewhat true in Majamaka, because you could say that you have ultimate truths and conventional truths. So I mean, I could say this is a table. That's conventional truth. This is not a table. Ultimate truth. And they don't contradict each other because they belong to different orders of truth. But if I say this is a table in conventional truth and this is a car, that's a contradiction, because if both are conventional statements, yes, there is a contradiction. But you're right that there is a different understanding of contradiction. So it's not that there isn't a law of non-contradiction, it's just that non-contradiction works differently. Again. Because there is non-contradiction at the conventional level. At the ultimate, if you comprise two levels of truth, no, not really. And that's very startling again, because the Aristotelian system does not work like this. That's all.
Well, it's been a very full and rich day, to draw things to a conclusion. This has been the inaugural conference of the new Institute for Introduced Relations. There will be many other events that will take place. Overall, of course, the purpose of the Institute is to explore in various different ways introduced relations, faithful to a Catholic perspective guided by the teaching of the Church. A major project within that is what we focused on today, exploring the Thomist approach to non-Christian religions and cultures, retrieving the Thomist tradition in order to apply it in the world today, in the expectation that this will be a fruitful way forward for all of us as we live in the world today and engage in different ways in introduced relations. But the Institute will also explore different aspects of introduced relations over the coming years. So in May, for instance, the next event will be an exploration of Ratzinger's theology of relations. Father Samir Advani will be talking about his work in this area. We're hoping that the website for the Institute will be up and running. The date we've got is the 14th of April. So I would encourage all of you to look from time to time at the general website of Angelicum, and in particular to look for that, the events and the projects that are taking place within the Institute. I want to thank everyone for coming today. I want to thank firstly Alejandra and Perita for working away. Alejandra is the secretary for both my institute and the Institute for Economic Studies, and she's done enormous amount of work in preparation today on all different levels to make it run very smoothly. So, and she's just started a few months ago to work for the centres, the two institutes. So we're grateful to her, and we encourage her in the work.